going back to the lead detective who really poured his heart and soul into this case, he said he thought that Anne just didn't want that impression in the community, that she didn't want to be a divorced woman, that she didn't want to share custody, that she didn't want to deal with, dividing assets. Again, I'm using what the lead investigator believed. Being a widow was a much better situation for her.
It was supposed to be a night of beers, bowling, and fun. But for Eric Miller, the night of November 15th, 2000, would mark the beginning of a tragic turn. Eric had a brilliant mind and a big heart and put both to good use working as a pediatric AIDS researcher. Professionally, he was respected by his colleagues. At home, he was a loving husband and a devoted father to a baby girl that he and his wife, Anne, had welcomed that January. It should have been a joyous year for the Miller family. However, the happy milestones were overshadowed by a mysterious illness that had been plaguing Eric. During the November 15th outing, Eric consumed a beer and noticed an odd taste. Not long after, he became violently ill. Doctors were puzzled by Eric's condition. The sickness was both mysterious and relentless. Over time, Eric's health deteriorated, and on December 2nd, he succumbed to his painful condition. Throughout it all, one person stayed by his side, his wife, Anne. But underneath the facade of a grieving widow was a sinister secret, a fatal dose of poison, carefully measured to end a life and hide a lie. I'm Emily Campagno, and this is the Fox True Crime Podcast. Eric Miller was not the kind of man that anyone would expect to become the center of a murder investigation, and certainly no one would suspect that his wife, Anne, was capable of murder. To outsiders, Eric and Anne were the Ken and Barbie of Raleigh's scientific community. Anne was beautiful, intelligent, and driven in her own right, working as a chemist at a large pharmaceutical company. In a modest home, the Millers lived comfortably, not lavishly, but contentment was not enough for Anne. She desired more money, more excitement, and attention from other men. Over time, that dissatisfaction brewed into something deadly, and investigators would discover that for 5 months, Anne had been poisoning her husband with arsenic. While working as a journalist, Amanda Lamb followed this case closely. Now an author and podcast host, she joins me today with an in-depth look at this chilling case, as detailed in her book, Deadly Dose. Let's start with you and your background. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you first learned of the atrocious murder of Eric Miller.
Great. So I was a TV reporter, local TV reporter, for 35 years. I spent 29 of that in Raleigh, North Carolina, at an award-winning station called WRAL. And about 20 years ago, so I've been out of the business about a year and a half, but about 20 years ago, they asked me to become a crime reporter. And I had always enjoyed covering crime. I grew up in Chester County, Pennsylvania, which is near Philadelphia. And my dad was the district attorney. So back then, no internet, 3 TV channels. My dad was taking me to court. I was watching murder trials. And so I was fascinated by the process, really thought I would go to law school and become a prosecutor. But I was interested in writing, and so I got into journalism after I graduated from college. And so when the opportunity came up to be a crime reporter, I thought, well, this is perfect. It marries a lot of the things that I'm really interested in, which is the criminal justice system, how it works, how an investigation works, and just how the process works from beginning to end. So I started basically covering every murder that happened in our area, which back then was not a lot. So this was late 90s, early 2000s. And this particular case, I can't remember exactly how I found out about it right when it happened. But a couple days in, I had a really good relationship with the lead investigator in the case. And he and I started talking, and I said, what do you think's going on here? And right away, they really thought that this man had been poisoned. And of course, in any kind of a murder case, you start in the inner circle, right? And you move out. So pretty quickly, the wife of the man who was poisoned became a suspect. But that wasn't enough, just a hunch. You have to have the evidence. And so this was a really complex case, and it took many, many years to solve.
Okay, so please set the stage for us. Who were Eric and Ann Miller? How did they meet? Talk to us about then the line of work that they both got into and all that stuff. Give us that background.
Yeah, so they were both very accomplished scientists. They met in college, and I think by all accounts were both smitten right away. Got married, bought their first house, had a child. Eric was a pediatric AIDS researcher at the University of North Carolina, a very prestigious university hospital. And she worked for a pharmaceutical company. Again, in the lab, she was a scientist. So both very accomplished, but kind of in the process of building their careers and also raising a young family.
And it's my understanding that he sort of eschewed what could have been a very lucrative career to pursue this very noble effort and endeavor of working with pediatric AIDS and research, and that they were sort of referred to as Barbie and Ken, like by all senses of the outside, at least. They were this really perfect couple with at least for him, obviously, a huge heart.
Exactly. And, both very attractive, both very outgoing. I mean, we heard stories about, holiday gatherings for Halloween in the neighborhood, and he would make goodie bags for all the kids, that he just really loved kids. Yeah. And I mean, he was doing something. If you think about the time frame, this would have been late 90s, early 2000s. He was doing something really noble. He was working on an issue that was a worldwide issue where people were really concerned about young children and babies being infected with the HIV virus. So yeah, he was a really great guy by all accounts.
What was the Millers' family life like together? Were there any fissures that seemed to show? Were there red flags to the neighbors or family members or?
Not that we could tell. I mean, obviously hindsight's 2020. People look back and they start to see things that maybe they didn't see before. But they were regular churchgoers. They were, again, connected with their community, with their neighborhood. They were both involved in activities outside of work where, they had a bowling league, for example, that they participated in. And so I think they just seemed like a regular all-American couple, raising a family, working hard, doing all the things that a lot of people do to, set themselves up for a comfortable life.
And so you mentioned the bowling. And so in November of 2000, Eric went out bowling with his friends, and then something happened. Walk us through what happened.
So it was actually Ann's bowling group. It was made up of some of her friends from work, and they invited him to fill in because she wasn't allegedly available that night. So while they're bowling, people are buying pitchers of beer. And one of the men in the group bought a pitcher of beer and poured a glass for Eric specifically. And Eric tasted the beer and he said, this doesn't taste right. And the man who poured the beer then spilled the beer and apologized and said, okay, yeah, let's get another one. Eric got very sick after that. So later, investigators were able to piece together that someone in that group, again, the wife's not there, but someone in that group had put arsenic in that beer, and that's what made him sick.
And when they pieced that together, was that in real time in that hospitalization or later?
No, they did it much later.
Okay.
Right. This was they were able to account for multiple times that he was actually poisoned. And when they looked back at his hair, because hair really holds arsenic and the record of arsenic for a very long time if you get it from the root, it looked like he had been poisoned for maybe 6 months. Arsenic is not cumulative. I mean, yes, it does cause breakdowns in your organs and things like that, but really to be killed by arsenic, it's just one dose. So questions about why would you continually poison somebody, not to the point of death, unless either you don't understand how much it takes to kill someone or you're trying to torture them.
Oh,
And create a pattern, oh, this person's sickly,
right. It's so flowers in the attic.
Yeah.
So to that point, 6 days later, he was hospitalized again after dinner with his wife. And that was worse. And my question is, during that time then, as this became a pattern, to your point, hindsight is 2020, but did he articulate to the doctors concerns about his health or hypotheses about what was going on? Or did he feel that his symptoms were reflective of something, more sinister or an outside influence other than his own biology? Or what do we know about that stuff?
No, and I remember police officers who tried to interview him or did interview him in the hospital saying, he was completely oblivious to the thought that he was being poisoned, especially by his wife. Like he had no belief that that was actually happening, nor did his family. And so yeah, it was very curious because he just maintained that, he didn't know what was going on. And arsenic poisoning eventually causes all sorts of horrible symptoms, but one of them is hallucinating. And so he was really out of it at a certain point and could no longer really communicate about what he thought was going on. But at no time did he say that he thought his wife had poisoned him.
And you contrast this with the Ridgens case, for example, where the husband was telling other people, I think my wife is trying to poison me, and, eating. And that too happened multiple times. And then eventually he died, which is horrible. But here, to your point, Eric seemed to have zero idea. Can you describe then his physical state? So this is now a period over, we learn later, 6 months. But you talked about how at that end point he had gotten to the phase of hallucinations and the like. Can you sort of describe what was happening to him physically before he ultimately died? What that looked like at the end for him.
Yeah, I mean, they described it in some of the court documents, and also his family described it. Basically, arsenic is eating away at your organs. And, he became almost like a shell of the person he was before. I mean, all of his organs were failing. He wasn't eating, obviously wasn't drinking. And then again, it also affected his brain function. And so it's a very, very painful death. It's not, sometimes I think we think of poison as something that, you take it and then you just die. In this situation, I mean, he lived, and I can't remember exactly how many hours or days he lived after this deadly dose, the final dose. But, it was terrible, according to his family, who was there by his bedside.
At that time, did his colleagues or anyone in the scientific community, obviously as he was going through this and being supported by his colleagues, were there any questions over maybe accidental exposure, or as doctors were trying to diagnose, what were those conversations or concerns like?
Yeah, and I mean, I recently reconnected with the prosecutor on this case, and he said, the first thing you're going to look at is accidental exposure. Yeah. You're going to say, could this person, he's a scientist, he's in a laboratory, could he have been exposed in the lab? Could he have been exposed to something in his lawn care regimen? Because, it's only been, I'm not sure exactly how many years, but there's certain chemicals that are banned, but were allowed to be used on the lawn. And I think some of them did involve arsenic. So they looked at all of that, but they didn't originally know it was arsenic. That's one of the issues. So when somebody's this sick, heavy metals poisoning is not the first thing you think of. And so they did a test, and there's two different types of tests. There's a urine test and a blood test. So the original test came back much higher than it would be expected if you were looking at it from a blood perspective than a urine perspective. So ended up that they weren't immediately realizing, oh my gosh, like this guy's been poisoned with a huge amount of arsenic. Eventually they figured that out. And I think once they ruled out the laboratory and anything in the yard, they started saying, okay, this is a murder. And who has access to him? Who has access to him in the hospital?
And then can you just confirm for me, was the conclusion that it was arsenic poisoning, did that happen after his death? Or just prior to his death?
It was just prior. In other words, all of this was happening kind of in tandem. He was sent to a higher level hospital for testing at one point. It was all kind of happening in tandem. And I think that information maybe was 48 hours before he died. And at that point, I mean, they weren't going to be able to save his life. So it was all very fluid. And it was not something that this police department had ever dealt with before. I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, there are national cases, and North Carolina is actually home to two very high profile cases, historic cases of arsenic poisoning. So, it's just not something that investigators thought of at that point.
And it might not have been, I assume he did not then, if it was within 48 hours of his death, that means that his mental state was far altered at that point. So he never quite knew that it indeed was arsenic, what the diagnosis was.
Correct.
Can you walk listeners through exactly about arsenic? You've described it in bits and pieces, but also like the access, where does one get it or what is it, so that people can sort of understand too? Because then, all right, investigators start to piece it together, and then how do they go about identifying who would even have access to the substance, let alone to Eric?
So in this case, it came from the wife's lab at a big pharmaceutical company. Back then, they didn't have a process for signing it out, if you will, to say, I'm taking out, however much arsenic you would take to do something like that. I'm taking a cup or I'm taking a bag. Now they do. I mean, obviously, the safeguards were just not there. So any scientist in this lab at that time was able to simply, take as much arsenic as they wanted to. And so that's where it came from. And again, I would imagine that pharmaceutical companies all over the country and the world probably changed their procedures after this.
So then once investigators are gelled together and starting to explore, starting with the inner circle, how did Anne react to them questioning her, or simply just in the early stages? Was she cooperative? And then when did the police begin looking at Eric's friend, Daryl?
So she was cooperative to a point. She did, I think, originally talk to the police with her dad, and then pretty quickly got an attorney and, shut that down. And then they started to do research, started to talk to people, started to investigate, and they found out that she had had multiple affairs, but she had had one affair with a man in the community who happened to be at the bowling night, who happened to be the one that poured the beer, who happened to be the one that spilled the beer. And so they started, really focusing on him, because there was a thought, well, maybe he, wanted to get rid of this man because he was, in a relationship with the wife. And that man went and spoke to an attorney and said, look, I think I'm in trouble. I'm being looked at for this case, and I didn't do it. Can you help me? And so that was kind of the next phase, if you will.
Yeah. So walk us through what happened next then. How did that phase unfold?
Right. So he tells his attorney some confidential information, and including the information about the beer that we all later found out. But he tells his attorney that Anne had met him in a parking lot close to the hospital and had said to him, I put arsenic in Eric's IV in the hospital. But there's attorney-client privilege, right? Which is guarded very carefully in North Carolina and in every other part of the country, as it should be. So this attorney can't tell the police what his client has told him. Well, then his client takes his own life. And so now that information has quite literally gone to the grave with this man. But the district attorney says, okay, there's got to be a way to get this information without this attorney violating the privilege. The wife of the man who, took his own life said, I heard this. He told me this. I'm willing to testify. But that wasn't enough, because attorney-client privilege actually, it is death doesn't take it away. It's still part of the law. So what ended up happening was the DA takes this case all the way to the Supreme Court of North Carolina. And the Supreme Court crafted this very, very narrow ruling that said, if you know something about a murder case that could solve the case, and it does not indict your client, then you can reveal it. So it was just a very narrowly crafted ruling. And so it ended up, after many years of going through this, that this attorney was able to tell the judge, yes, she said she put arsenic in his IV when he was in the hospital. And that was enough to bring the case to a conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, usually I was thinking that the privilege extends to, the protection of the client. Anne wasn't the client of that person. It was Daryl. So
correct. And it was after his death, but and it wasn't enough for the wife to say it. There's lots of rules about
Hearsay.
spouses testifying and hearsay and things like that. So and this attorney who was the one that actually revealed it, I also recently spoke with him, and he just said, look, I didn't have a dog in the fight, but I had to do what was right and I had to protect the privilege. And he obviously eventually was able to release that information, but only after the Supreme Court of North Carolina made this very narrow decision.
Which I'm grateful for. While it took a while to have that play out, it's actually a good thing because it solidified then in the law that privilege, the exception that most other states have already, that enables, justice to be served, because privilege it's we have to go back to what is the purpose of things.
Right.
And that's why these privileges are not absolute and they can be waived. That's why the spousal privilege can be waived, et cetera. Let's back up a little bit, because so when Daryl took his own life, that was shortly after police executed a search warrant on his home. And then he left that note. So was it other friends in the group, to your point, they were investigating, they're interviewing everyone, and was it others that said, look, these two are together? And how did that sort of unfold?
I can't recall exactly how that part unfolded, but they were able to look at a lot of information and realize that she just was not a faithful spouse, and that there had been another man, I believe he was in California, and they were exchanging love letters. There was information on her computer to that effect. So Daryl was not, he was one of multiple affairs, and he was a victim. In a way, when you look at this situation, he was in this relationship and, by all purposes, believed that, she was in love with him and might leave her spouse for him. And honestly, it looked like she was trying to use him to help with this, plan to get rid of her husband. Yeah.
Can I ask, in that, either the suicide note or what he shared with his attorney that was able to be revealed later, did he say he was a willing participant? When he poured the glass in the beer, did he know what he was doing? Or when Anne told him that, was that
right,
true and unrelated from his participation?
No, I think he knew what he was doing, and that's why he spilled it, because he realized, I'm not cut out for this. I don't want to hurt somebody. And, I think there was a lot of remorse. And his attorney, again, recently told me that he believed Daryl was just heartbroken by what he had done to his family and couldn't live with it, That he wasn't scared of prosecution. He was afraid of how everything would play out for his family.
So how did the final pieces of the puzzle come together? And, something that we can sort of, let's start with there, and then I'll get into the motive for the jury later.
I mean, I think once they had that piece of information of what Daryl said, I don't think there was any question that she would likely be convicted. And so that's when they start talking and negotiating, because she was a very charming person. And she was a person that had a way of kind of presenting herself as demure and maybe almost like childlike, even though she was a very accomplished scientist. So she was not, a childlike figure, but they were worried. They were worried that if she took the stand, how that was going to play out for a jury. And, it only takes one person for a mistrial. So they ended up offering her a plea deal for second-degree murder, and she took it. And that was based on this new information that they had. And I don't think this case certainly would never have gone to a plea deal, maybe not even gone to trial, if they had not gotten that piece of information from Daryl Willard's attorney.
And how did the community react to that plea deal? Because, for example, and also Eric's family, because we saw, for example, in the recent Koberger plea deal that some victims' families of his felt frustrated by that. They wanted to see a more formal procedure, play out, and others were relieved that there wasn't a trial to relive their trauma, and the community, was sort of mixed. So Do you know how the reaction was at the time, whether they felt justice was served?
I think that at least in the county here where I've spent most of my career, the district attorney is very careful not to take a plea without discussing it with the family. And I know in this case, it was discussed at length. And basically, what they were weighing was, okay, if we go to trial and she's found not guilty, that's it. It's done. They had a child, and there was a feeling that they wanted that child to grow up and then be able to make her own decision about her relationship with her mother. And so they wanted to get past that 18-year mark because the child was a baby, was a toddler. And so this got them there. In court, they had victim impact statements when Anne was sentenced. And Eric's family, and specifically his two sisters, got up and they were so emotional and so passionate and so destroyed by what had happened. And they just let it all out. They just shared their feelings. But they also had agreed to this plea and understood why it was important. As far as the community goes, I think people were just shocked by the whole case. It was just such an unusual case. And I think people were, frankly, there's not that many female killers. It's still an unusual thing. And so I think people were pretty shocked by it.
And what was the sentence for the second-degree murder?
Sure. So she received a minimum of 25 years, and she will be out. She got some time served. She will be out in 2029. So not that long.
And you mentioned the daughter, and it's my understanding that as a young girl, she wanted to visit her mother in prison, but Eric's family fought against it. Do you recall how that played out?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, Eric's parents were older, and so they knew they weren't going to be around to raise this child. But the sisters were willing to be involved. And so they had a visitation agreement where the daughter would spend a certain amount of time with Anne's sister in Wilmington, North Carolina, and then also spend some summer time and holidays with Eric's family. So there was a lot of back and forth, and I don't know at this point what she decided. I do know that she is 25 years old, and at this point in her life, obviously, she may or may not have a relationship with her mother. It's her choice.
Yeah. Who had primary custody, though?
Anne's sister had primary custody. And during some of the custody hearings, there was a lot of concern about Anne's sister still thinking that Anne was not guilty. And how would that impact the child? And so there was a lot of discussion about, she's got to be honest with her. She's got to tell her what actually happened. And so usually when these things happen, the child ends up with the other, the family of the victim. So it was pretty unusual. But I also think that the court certainly would not have been okay with Anne's sister having custody unless they thought she was in a safe, nurturing environment. So there's no indication that she was not in a safe and nurturing environment.
Yeah. And just to think about, the traumas of the families who've lost a loved one. Eric's family lost Eric. Amy's family, Eric's family, I keep thinking Amy. You know why I keep thinking Amy? Because we will edit this part out, but because of Gone Girl.
Oh, yeah.
I literally, because I feel like Anne is Gone Girl. So in my head this whole time, like I've been like the second that I read about this, I was like, it's Amazing Amy. Remember how she had the books, Amazing Amy, whatever. So, sorry, I keep saying Amy.
No, you're good.
Only
you're good.
From that.
You're good.
Yeah, and I think about the added trauma. So Eric's family lost Eric, and Anne's family lost Anne too, in a different way, right? And so my point is to have during the legal proceedings and their emotional grief, and the shock of, the loss, and also recognizing that your loved one is capable of this horrific thing and did it, but then also to have the custody proceedings on top of that too. Yeah, it's just a multi-layer of trauma that I empathize with for these families, where I think oftentimes, because the whole point is a will doesn't matter to a point unless you've, you account for incapacitation, but I don't know if she had that, like, that's not...
The children lose both parents, and I've covered many, many cases like this. I actually wrote a book about this case called Deadly Dose. This was actually my first of many books. But in this book, we get into detail about the ripple effect of a murder case, where it goes out in concentric circles. It's affecting the children, it affects the parents, it affects the friends, it affects the extended family, it affects the coworkers, the community. And the children are, the biggest victims here for sure.
Yeah. Going back to that plea deal, and we sort of have talked about that, enabling that piece of evidence to be introduced is likely the linchpin that led to the plea deal in a good way. But it's my understanding, Anne retained Wade Smith and Joe Cheshire, the lawyers who successfully defended the Duke lacrosse players. Do you think that had a lot to do with it, having these very seasoned, high-profile, excellent defense attorneys? So does that weigh into the analysis of, and perhaps they didn't go to trial because they had these, did prosecution entertain that?
Both of them are just top-notch attorneys, not just here in North Carolina, but in the country. Yeah. And so her having those attorneys, absolutely. You've got two really experienced attorneys. They know the criminal justice system. They know the judges. They know the DA. I mean, they have a collegial relationship. And at the end of the day, I think if people are represented by very high power attorneys who are also very experienced and very good at what they do, they have a better shot for sure of getting a deal.
Yeah. We talked earlier about the torture, either torture or towing the line of why someone would poison another person as a pattern. Because to your point, arsenic doesn't work in buildable volumes. It's just one time. Can you sort of describe for us what the general understanding was by investigators at the conclusion in terms of, her motive? Homicide is never justifiable, obviously, but she clearly had a motive. Why did she want him dead and not just divorce? And do they conclude that indeed she was enjoying the torture of her husband? And is that why she was doing that? Can you speak to those conclusions?
Yeah, I don't know if they ever concluded that she was enjoying the torture. I think ultimately Detective Chris Morgan, who was the lead investigator, believed that she was trying to set up a pattern. This guy is sick. He's got some strange disease. He's got something strange going on, because he was constantly going to the hospital and having these symptoms, and he was out of work and he was not able to do, different things with friends and family. And so I think she believed this pattern would then, when he died, people would just say, oh, he's been sick for a while. Yeah, this guy's been sick for a while. The sidebar effect, though, is that he was definitely being tortured. In terms of why, she didn't just leave. So that's always the question in a domestic violence murder. Why don't people just leave? And in this situation, again, going back to the lead detective who really poured his heart and soul into this case, he said he thought that Anne just didn't want that impression in the community, that she didn't want to be a divorced woman, that she didn't want to share custody, that she didn't want to deal with, dividing assets. They were pretty involved in their church, a Catholic church. They were actually leading like a marriage support group. I mean, so they were out there as this one thing and as pillars in this community. And she didn't want to lose that. She thought being a widow, again, I'm using what the lead investigator believed, being a widow was a much better situation for her.
Just the futility of these motives. It just kills me. That is just so horrifying that, choose widow over divorcee, right. But really what you are is a murderer, and that's the label that will stick, and families are destroyed in the process.
Yeah, and it's a question that you ask in every domestic violence case, and most of the time you're dealing with a male murderer and not a female, but it's the same thing. You say, well, why would he do that? Why wouldn't he just get a divorce? And then the answers are, I don't want to share custody. I don't want my assets divided. I don't want to pay alimony. I don't want people to perceive me in such a way, and I mean, it's a crazy way of thinking for normal people, because we wouldn't think that way. But unfortunately, I think a lot of people who, commit these crimes are sociopaths.
Yeah, you're right. When I hear, when convenience is it's just.
And we're not talking about a lot of money. I mean, that's the thing. most of these murders, we're not talking about people they're just starting out their lives. Right. They don't have a lot of money. They're not dividing, millions and billions of dollars in their estates. It's a pretty simple division.
Right. If they had divorce, the equitable division of assets would have been neat and clean.
Right.
Yeah. And I just think about with Eric, I think the reason why this story piques so much emotional reaction in me is just because Eric was obviously such a good person. And I think about the lost opportunity of a career ahead of him working with, pediatric AIDS. And I think about how many potentially millions of lives could have been saved with his continued work. And that is what is destroyed too. And so it's just such a shame. Amanda, where can people find you and your incredible book, Deadly Dose, which is so gripping? You'll read it in one sitting, guys. Where can they find that, and what's going on next for you? What projects?
So they can find that on Amazon. My website is alambauthor.com, A-L-A-M-B, author, A-U-T-H-O-R.com, like Mary Had a Little Lamb. And I actually just started a new podcast. It's called Crime Capsule, ripped from the pages of a reporter's notebook. You can find it anywhere you get your podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Apple, and we are on Instagram at crime.capsule and then on Facebook at Crime Capsule Podcast. And actually, I have an episode on this case. So, so we're looking into, it's myself and another crime reporter. We've been reporters for over 50 years combined. And so we just decided to look at high profile cases that we both covered and kind of do the behind the scenes stuff. So I'm excited about that. And then I also am a fiction writer. So I have a new book out called Whispers on the Mountain, and it's a murder mystery set in the North Carolina mountains, and it's about a missing hiker. So check that all out on my website.
Amazing. And then do you want to just leave listeners with some final thoughts on the Miller case?
Yeah, I mean, again, I've covered many, many cases in my career, but I think cruelty is what I come up with when I think about this case. And just the fact that anybody thinks they have the right, that they are entitled to take another person's life. It's not okay. It never is okay. And it's just really, I would say it's pure narcissism. And it's very shocking and it's very sad. And no matter how many times I talk about this case, I think about it every time. I think about that child. And I think, how could a parent deprive their child of another parent? As long as that parent isn't abusive, obviously, which no indication. So how could a parent do that? Even if they really can't stand the spouse, how could they do that to a child? So as a mom, that just makes me, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah. You hit the nail on the head, and that's, like I said, this is the kind of case that just sticks with you. Well, guys, please read Deadly Dose and then Amanda's fiction novel, Whispers on the Mountain. You can reach her at alambauthor.com, and definitely check out her podcast, Crime Capsule, because I know for a fact that those are amazing episodes, and your experience is so gripping too, and so unparalleled and insightful. So, you definitely don't have the 50 years of experience. I was like, how can you have 50 years when you're
not
21 years old looking, obviously, but the combined experience is certainly...
the combined experience,
super validating and awesome. So, guys, dive in for Amanda Lamb, and thank you so much for joining us today on the Fox True Crime Podcast. We're so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.